I've sent around the room a handout, which I spent some time in the last several days compiling, because I realized as I was getting ready for this lecture that I was really trying to write 2 lectures. And there's just way too much information that I'd like to convey to you. And some of it is fairly complicated. And so I've constructed a timeline that deals with acts and events associated with both federal and Oregon state and territorial laws and movements that pertain to race and to immigration. So I hope you find this useful, because I'm not going to be going through it in a systematic way. I'm also going to give a kind of bifurcated lecture, and I apologize about this in advance. But given what I do for a living, which is I've been working in Old Town since the late 90s, working with a variety of ethnic groups, and have become, completely enamored and dedicated to that very unique, multi-ethnic and multiracial community and to its history. And so I am already someone who feels strongly about issues that concern those who have made their living and have lived there or grown up there in the last 100 years. But also recent events convinced me that I needed to say some things tonight that I'm not sure I would have said, because I'm not myself a person of color, but I do feel as though some of the history in Oregon that many of you may not be aware of really does need to be aired. So bear with me for this first 10 minutes of my talk when we go through some fairly, I think, difficult and maybe problematic ideas. And you may or may not agree with them, and that's fine. We'll have plenty of time at the end of the talk for me to engage you in conversation. So let's get started. I'm going to start with some kind of intellectual word analysis. So we're going to talk about 2 sets of words and 2 themes. One is a subtext of the other. Both of these are Oregon stories, but only one of them is widely known. This first story, and this is the story that you all learned in school, is the master narrative of enterprising white pioneers or settlers turning an empty landscape into bountiful farms and orchards. Now, recently, scholars have begun to take this narrative apart and to describe this pioneer vanguard, and pay attention to that word vanguard, as settler colonialism, an acknowledgement that Oregon was neither virgin nor uninhabited, as David Lewis's first lecture in this series taught us several months ago. This new term, relatively new term, settler colonialism, is a useful one, I think, because it gets at something deeper. That is to say that the vanguard carried with it laws and beliefs and prejudices of the white American nation standing behind it. And let's think about this term settler or settlers. Were these early settlers to the Northwest, whether crossing the Oregon Trail or arriving by ship around the Horn, also immigrants and or migrants? Is this word settler coded? Let's try to unpack it a little bit. The word, I think, is closely associated with early arrival, first comers. It also refers to free land owning, and especially in the 19th century with free rural land. In Oregon, this group of people would have been overwhelmingly white males with families who were native-born American citizens. So then, what do we do with foreign nationals, or the people we call immigrants? Could they be settlers too? In the mid-19th century, travel literature, including that promoting Oregon, the word immigrant was often used as a synonym for settler. And certainly Northern European immigrants, like the Irish, who were drawn to fertile land and St. Paul's Catholic Church in Marion County and numbered more than 100 of the Oregon donation land claimants, and the some 700 Scandinavians arriving in Oregon before 1870, they were all considered white and guaranteed property rights and naturalization as American citizens as a matter of course. Even the Finns, who arrived in Astoria as early as 1850 and contributed to its growth as a major fish processing and canning center, were soon on a path to American citizenship and inclusion despite their socialist politics. The same would be true of British Isles, German, Belgian, Dutch, and other Northern European immigrants who settled in rural and small-town Oregon. Now, the term settler also carries with it a set of rights and privileges associated with citizenship, with nationality, that is to say, to being an American, which gives you the right to live on the land, to own land, to move freely, and to vote. While property qualifications for voting had disappeared in the United States by the 1850s, such privileges, which we take for granted today, were reserved for white men only. White male privilege was also embedded in the Oregon territorial and state constitutions, as you see in your handout, and would remain in existence much longer than in other Western states. In the wake of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which granted slaves citizenship and the right to vote, most of the United States gradually enlarged its vision of what constituted an American. The glaring exception was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and its successors, which treated Asians as a group ineligible for American citizenship until after World War II. In Oregon, in addition to these federal laws, separate state exclusionary laws based on race were passed as late as the 1920s. A bill to prevent Japanese American so-called enemy aliens, who were Japanese Americans born in Oregon, from residing and owning property in Oregon after returning from the internment camps, was entered but finally defeated in the state legislature in the 1940s. And Oregon's public accommodation law, which basically allowed people of color, and I'm told by friends who are also Greek and Italian, that in the day, even they had trouble at Myron Frank and at Jansen Beach, were not considered white. The public accommodations law, which was passed in California and Washington on both sides of Oregon before 1920, was not passed in Oregon until 1953, more than 30 years later. What are we to make of this? Let's look now at this second term, or let's look at settlers and immigrants from a slightly different perspective. Let's look at those who have been classified by this other group as non-white. We've explored some of the meanings associated with the term settler. Let's compare those meanings with those associated with the words immigrant and migrant. Although all three of these words suggest physical movement across space, and all the attendant fears, loss of family and friends, hardships, and costs that migration entailed for everyone making such a journey, there are nonetheless striking differences. Unlike the term settler, the terms immigrant and migrants do not always carry with them promises or guarantees of land ownership, permanent residence, citizenship, and the right to vote. But what do we call the successful Chinese laundry owner in Salem in 1870? Or Doc Hay of Kamwachung in John Day? Or the prosperous Japanese orchardists and produce farmers and suppliers around Hood River or in Fairview, Oregon? Or the African barbers, cooks, and waiters recruited by the Northern Pacific Railroad to come and live in Portland? Settler? Immigrant? Migrant? Do these words have anything to do with race? Part 2. The title of the talk, A Good Beginning, comes from this quote. It's actually a rather late quote, but it's one that just moved me when I heard it, and it's still one of my favorite expressions of an immigrant first arriving in Portland and talking about what he sees. This is George Pappas. He says, "I'm landing at the train station, right? So I'm right here. Come to Portland. I'm right in the old town. So my brother picks me up and drives me by the Demas Tavern where my father worked, and I'm seeing it. Even though it looks like a slum, let's say, to me, it doesn't look like that. It looks like a good beginning." There were always two stories of Portland. One was the story of a proper white and rain-washed town peopled by young, enterprising Easterners from New England and New York. This is the well-known story of Portland's pioneers, urban pioneers, an emergent white business and social elite whose interest in land was less settlement in the rural sense than land speculation, along with finance, grain export, and transportation. The second story is closer to reality. In 1890, 1/3 of Portland residents were foreign-born. 1/2 of all Portlanders had at least one foreign-born parent, meaning that within a large number of Portland households, someone was always speaking a language other than English. Germans were far and away the largest European ethnic group in 1890, with the Irish in second place. But Portland's Chinese community was nearly as large as the two combined. In fact, in 1890 and 1900, Portland could boast the second largest Chinatown in the United States, next to San Francisco. Before a growing nexus of streetcars, rail lines, and bridges expanded the city's size and the ability of its residents to move about freely, Portland's residential pattern was best described as a stew. In 1870, the town of some 8,200 people stretching along the waterfront from Gleason to Taylor contained frame houses and brick mansions of merchants of all backgrounds, as well as the dwellings, businesses, and boarding houses of virtually every ethnic group and class. But things were about to change. The death of John Couch, the founder of Portland, or at least the North End, Couch's Edition, in 1870 coincided with the passage of Portland from 19th century Rivertown to modern northwestern city. Over the next 30 years, Portland would grow from a population of 8,200 to 90,000 and some by 1900. A decade later, after the boom and hoopla of the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition had ended, Portland would number 207,214 souls, and that number would almost double again in the next 10 years. In 1870, however, the spacious family homes and gardens of the Couch clan, including the old captain and his wife, his daughters, their spouses, Cicero Lewis, Rodney Glisson, and Robert Wilson, and 15 grandchildren, stretched like a green ribbon from Hoyt to Burnside between Northwest 4th and 5th. But the 6 square blocks occupied by these proprietors were increasingly surrounded by a noisy mixture of grog shops, laundries, livery stables, small industries like the Nikolai Brothers Sash and Door Factory, which opened at Northwest 2nd and Everett in 1870, and the Povey Brothers Glass Company. Along North Front, on the eastern edge of the district, a jumble of warehouses and wharves lined the shore from Ankeny to Everett. At the south end, near Burnside Street, on the west side, 3 Jewish dry good merchants, Jacob Brothers and Company, Philip Wasserman Company. Philip, of course, Wasserman was one of 2 early Jewish mayors of the city, and L. Goldsmith Company, sharing a 3-story brick structure flanked on the north end by a low-slung frame bar and roadhouse. There was evidence from the 1850s and 60s that the rough and tumble boarding houses and grog shops of the North End, or Couch's Edition, north of Ankeny, were attracting German and Irish immigrant workers. Many of the most prominent early German Jewish merchants, as well as a number of German brewers, also made North Front, 1st and 2nd Avenues their domestic and business addresses. 5 years before Couch's death in 1865, the western half of the Couch's Edition was finally platted, And Captain Cooch immediately donated to the city the 6 square blocks running north from Burnside to Hoyt to be reserved as park blocks. So after 1872, the North Park blocks would serve as a gateway to 2 new city districts in the Northwest District. Between Northwest 8th and 15th, in what is now the Pearl District, a mixture of single and multifamily dwellings, small industries, and businesses owned and managed by immigrant workers and their families would transform the landscape. And this would become first a German and African American, and later a Scandinavian ethnic enclave. Henry Weinhardt's City Brewery, which moved from Vancouver, Washington to Northwest 11th and B in the late 1860s, was the first and most successful of several breweries established by German immigrants west of the North Park blocks. By 1870, fellow German immigrant Ferdinand Jubitz, this is the ancestor of the current owners of the Jubitz Company and Foundation, had opened a small Berliner Weissbier brewery at Northwest 9th and E, to be joined in 1878 by Molson's Brewery at Northwest 9th and B. The Weissbier brewery closed at Ferdinand's death in 1880, but his widow, a midwife, stayed on at Northwest 9th and E, meaning Everett, close to other Germans, and to her son Albin, who would soon move his own family to the edge of the North Park blocks. By the end of the 1860s, a social, financial, and political elite of several dozen American and Bavarian businessmen, both German and German Jews, was firmly entrenched. I think it's noteworthy that in these early decades of Portland's growth, that many of the financial leaders were Jews. This was unusual. Portland, in some ways, it was, I think, its very isolation that allowed these very enterprising merchants and businessmen to basically work closely with the white elite and not suffer any clear discrimination until quite a bit later, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they were very much a part of the original elite. Finally, in 1869, Portland's long-awaited speculative real estate market took off. The investments of this elite created a new style for Portland and inaugurated the age of cast iron architecture, an ornate Gilded Age manifestation of wealth and power. In 1879, the gracious house erected at First and Pine by John Ainsworth became the first home of the Arlington Club, created by this Portland elite. Symbolically, however, and very important in that same year, Jewish members were denied entrance to the Arlington Club, and as a result created their own Concordia Club to form a Jewish men's social club. Ironically, the rush to build along Front, First, and Second north of Alder would not result in an enduring waterfront business district. The extraordinarily beautiful cast iron buildings of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s were built on sand, and 6 floods between 1860 and 94 should have been warning enough. The Great Flood of 1894 inundated buildings along Front, First, and Second from Morrison to Glisson, and it was the last straw. Even though a seawall would later contain the Willamette, Portland moved to higher ground. I mention this because that is a standard sort of explanation for the movement of the elite from the waterfront further west. And it is true that repeated floods and fire do help to explain the sudden abandonment of Southwest Front and First Avenues as a business destination in the 1890s. But it seems to me that there may be another, or at least a partial explanation, occurring between Pine and Morrison. Despite city ordinances meant to harass and fine Chinese immigrants into leaving, an alien quarter was growing up along Southwest 2nd Avenue, stretching from Pine ultimately all the way to Taylor. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which denied entry to new Chinese workers or to the families of men already here, certainly began to take its toll. But nonetheless, in 1890, Portland's Chinatown was still the second largest Chinatown in the United States. In 1900, a majority of its 7,000 Chinese residents were single male workers, largely unemployed, former railroad workers, with no means to pay passage home. They crowded into tiny rooms, sharing a common bath and kitchen per floor in 3-story tenement buildings, and spent their leisure time in the gambling houses and lottery parlors lining 2nd Avenue. The first Chinese merchants had arrived in Portland in the early 1850s. These were not poor peasants from the interior of China. These were men of means in many instances, and they had come from a part of China which had had a long experience with commercial dealings with the outside world and international shipping. Their numbers grew slowly, 20 in 1860, nearly 500 in 1870, 1,700 in 1880. Thomas Dwyer, the first editor of the Oregonian, called them Celestials. They opened restaurants, hotels, laundries, import stores selling Chinese wares, foods, medicines. There was actually a very large contingent very early on of Chinese medicine practitioners. For the most part, Portland's elite business community benefited from their presence and appreciated the hard-working Chinese house servants, truck gardeners and vendors, woodcutters and fire hose pumpers, and the ubiquitous launderers. But European immigrant laborers themselves viewed the Chinese as a growing threat. Anti-Chinese rallies temporarily roiled the towns of Portland and Milwaukee, but because of the intervention of the white elite, who valued Chinese employees and allies, these intense anti-Chinese riots and expulsion of the Chinese further north and to the south in Tacoma and California, and the very massacres of Chinese miners in eastern Oregon at Hell's Canyon, those in Idaho and Wyoming during the 1880s, were not repeated in Portland. For a short time at least, before 1900, Portland was considered to be the most hospitable place on the West Coast for Chinese immigrants. Portland's Chinatown differed so radically from other parts of the city that it seemed a foreign country. And travelers and even journalists described it thusly. Chinese residents redesigned and visually transformed the 2- and 3-story frame and brick buildings, which they often built themselves on land they rented from white merchants. They added wooden balconies, bamboo lanterns, banners, Cantonese signs for businesses and addresses, good luck and religious symbols. In the attempt to recreate the social, cultural, and religious life that they had enjoyed in China, Chinese family, regional, and Tong protective associations stepped in to pay for funerals and to aid the needy. Merchants and their families established groceries, meat markets, and when they had saved enough, they pooled their capital to invest in real estate. The 6 Chinese companies, which would become the CCBA, or the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, built a group of stores in 1878 at Southwest 2nd and Alder for $10,500. The next year, a group of Chinese merchants developed a full brick block at 2nd and Alder for $20,000, and in 1880, a Chinese theater for the performance of Cantonese opera was built at a cost of $12,000. Such enterprise and cultural pride may have been the Chinese community's undoing. By 1890, Portland's white merchant elite had concluded that Chinese occupancy along Southwest 2nd from Pine to Alder was so entrenched that it formed a barrier to the continuous spread westward of high-end retail trade. After the flood of 1894, commercial development simply jumped over 2nd Avenue from 1st to 3rd, leaving Southwest Front and 1st to slowly decay. Simultaneously, the Chinese Exclusion Act led to a steady decline in Portland's Chinese population, beginning really not seriously until 1910, and of Chinatown itself. After 1900, Chinese merchants began to explore relocation to the North End, a district transformed by the completion of Union Station in 1896. By 1907, several groups of Chinese merchants and family associations were developing their own project. This is Chinese PDC, a string of 3 blocks of 3-story brick buildings with retail on the ground floor, mixed use, with housing and meeting space above, which stretched 3 blocks along the west side of Northwest 4th from Davis to Glisson. It would be a new beginning, a new Chinatown, and it stood on top of the former mansions of the members of the Cooch clan, the Cicero Lewises, the Rodney Glissons, and George Flanders' home. I'm aware that some of you may be surprised to learn that the original Chinatown and the very large Chinatown was south of Burnside, that what we call Chinatown today is really New Chinatown, which was founded seriously, although there were always Chinese businesses north of Burnside, small number. But 4th Avenue, which became the main thoroughfare of New Chinatown, wasn't established until between 1905 and 1910. The North End experienced a transformation in the last decades of the 19th century, as the Cooch clan and other merchants sold and abandoned their houses for new mansions in northwest Portland. This is obviously the far extent of Cooch's addition. And as 2- and 3-story brick warehouses and hotels rose in their place, the district assumed a new identity, known simultaneously as Portland's Whitechapel, named for the notorious red light district of London, and new home to ethnic groups and immigrants. The North End, which we now call Old Town, was wide open to all comers. The North End in 1910 held out a promise. New industries spawned by the invention of the automobile and moving pictures offered jobs and entertainment to working class men and women, many of whom were recent immigrants. The opening of Union Station provided jobs and brought travelers and shoppers to a new business district stretching south along 6th Avenue from the train station to Burnside. It was no wonder that Irish Americans, African Americans, and British, French, Bavarian, Polish, Sephardic Jews, Greeks, as well as Japanese and Chinese immigrants attempted to make a start here and to put down roots and to raise a family. What amazes was the degree to which members of each group, mixed among other ethnic groups within the same residential footprint, remembered this neighborhood as their neighborhood, their Chinatown, their Greek town, their Nihomachi or Japantown. But their children, who walked to Atkinson School at the corner of Northwest 11th and Davis, where the Armory is today, until it was closed as a fire hazard in 1932, these kids would make friends with other kids unlike themselves and begin to identify as hyphenated Americans. Following the waves of German, Irish, and Scandinavian workers who found jobs, built churches, and took up residence between Northwest 7th and 15th Street, I should say for those of you who are Scandinavian, there was at one time about 6 different churches for Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians in that small area. The first immigrant arrivals to the North End were from Japan, brought over by Japanese labor contractors to build railroads in the 1880s and 90s. Now, this is after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, so Japanese laborers were being brought in to replace Chinese laborers who really were left high and dry, with no money, no family, no way to get back to China, and really nowhere to live. And they strained the capacity of the existing merchant community here in Portland when they all began to return. That's an untold story. But they are being replaced by Japanese laborers who are being recruited by contractors. And they were soon joined after 1900 by other Japanese immigrant workers, some of them farmers, and their families who formed a community they called Nihomachi or Japantown. Between 1900 and 1910, a group of local and immigrant Chinese merchants also laid claim to the district, establishing a new Chinatown residential and business district, and I've mentioned this before, along Northwest 4th Avenue between Davis and Flanders. Are we going through this? Sorry. Yeah. These are some images from Nihomachi. Unlike many of the ethnic groups, the Germans had their own newspaper, but so did the Japanese, and this newspaper continued from the teens to the 1950s. It was located in the Merchant Hotel. If you want to back up one slide. This is the Merchant Hotel building. It's where Old Town Pizza is today. If you back up even one more slide, this is the back side of the Merchant Hotel, and this is actually where the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center, which is a wonderful museum that you can certainly visit and should, at 121 Northwest 2nd is within the Merchant Hotel, and the next two slides will take you around the corner to the front. If we go forward here, there we are to the front, and this is actually a photograph from 1942. This is the evacuation sale of the largest and most important mercantile department store in Japantown, or Nihomachi, which was called the Teokoku Company, which means imperial. The owner of this establishment was the first person arrested by the FBI when Executive Order 9066 was issued, and he was actually sent to a federal prison in Crystal City, Texas. There was never a single person of Japanese descent who was ever proven to have been an enemy alien. But this was the kind of abrogation of civil rights that occurred in the 40s. But I used this slide. It's the only one that I have that shows the Merchant Hotel, and you can sort of see halfway up the sort of typical sign for a business that is a Japanese dentist. And this was a building that was basically the heart, the center of Japantown, where numerous professionals and families lived, and the community was a lively one. The streets in front were the places where in the evenings, because there really weren't very many cars before the Second World War, where kids would meet right at that corner and play kick the can. There are many wonderful recollections of elders who grew up in this neighborhood talking about getting through school. All of these kids had to go to Japanese language school, just like the Chinese did after public school, that they would sort of rally and say, meet me at 3rd and Davis for a game of kick the can. So this was an important and enduring Japanese community, which, with a newspaper, again, which among the many occupations that were of importance to the Nikkei was management of hotels. We have two very different kinds of residential patterns on the part of these two Asian groups living in the same neighborhood. The Chinese tended to reside in the backs of their stores. And if you were wealthy, perhaps as early as the teens, you might be able to purchase a house through a white friend, or a child who had been born in this country in Ladd's Addition or Colonial Heights. Whereas the Japanese tended to manage hotels, residential hotels, which served this multi-ethnic population, and it provided housing for Japanese families. And many of these hotels are still in existence. Many of them are owned by Central City Concern today. This is a map that shows you, it's hard to see on the screen, but it shows you the larger map is the map of Japantown, Nihomachi, after the war, and the one that is smaller shows you the map after the war. So even though many people believe that Nihomachi never was restored, it wasn't certainly permanently, but many members of the Japanese American community did come back. George Azumano established his insurance company before his travel agency on Northwest 3rd, and the Japanese Ancestral Society was again located on Northwest 3rd, and so was the newspaper. So an effort was made, and still I think is being made in the hearts of members of this community, to hang on to this place where they were raised and where they had family businesses. We're going to move on now to the African American population. We're doing New Chinatown, sorry. I guess we are. So this is the map that I was referring to earlier. This is a map which shows you the geography, basically, from the park blocks to the waterfront, from Hoyt Street down to close to the Morrison Bridge. And I guess I will use this. I'm not good at this, but these lines basically take you through the Skidmore Landmark District, which is all of the cast iron. Sorry, this is the boundary of the Skidmore Landmark District. Sorry, I can't do both at the same time. Yeah, you want to do this? Okay, can you do it? Okay. she's going to be pointing out the boundaries for the Skidmore. Yeah, Skidmore Landmark District, which is a landmark district is the highest designation that the National Park Service gives for a National Historic District, and we have one. And adjacent to it and overlapping with it, there is a small New Chinatown, Japantown National Historic District, which stretches from Burnside to Glisson, from 3rd to 5th. Right in there. There you go. Now, many of us, if we had had anything to do with it back in '89, might have argued that there were good reasons, to have extended that boundary further west so that we could have included Greeks and Jews and African Americans in that district. And actually, there is a movement afoot now on the part of the Planning Bureau to look again at the nomination for this National Historic District. And so some of us are optimistic about seeing whether we can't make this a truly multi-ethnic district for Portland. It's unique in the sense that it is not focused so much on the importance of its architecture visually. There are some cast iron landmarks within this district. However, it's really about the lived experience of those people who grew up in this neighborhood. I mean, I've heard two things recently that really, I thought, said it all. One of them was the comment, a kind of bitter comment by a woman of Italian descent who said, you know, we used to have Little Italy, now we have a website. And Joanne Hong, who is the owner of the Great Era and the former Hung Far Low building, who's been in the neighborhood, her family had a restaurant in Old Chinatown, you know, said recently that if you lose the buildings, you lose the memory, and if you lose the memory, you lose the history. So, and this is something that I think a lot of people who are, you know, architecture supporters, I mean, who are preservationists, you know, really haven't quite gotten yet. This idea that place matters, it matters fundamentally. So we have here now New Chinatown. Isn't this beautiful? This feels like Paris to me. This is the rain-soaked street of Northwest 4th, about 1910, and here you have an example of these 3-story buildings. I happen to know many of the families that grew up in both of these blocks. So we were engaged in doing a very large oral history project with them. But these are really mixed-use buildings. The first floor are all manner of stores. The second and third floors are family apartments, and in some cases, the headquarters for various benevolent associations and family associations. Some of them are actually religious centers. So they serve many different purposes. And sadly, the only one of these that survives, and it's only 1 story. Back up. 1 story. Oh, actually, go ahead. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, this corner, the corner closest to you is where, for those of you who've been to this neighborhood in the last decade, it's barely there now, was a grocery store called Fong Chong and a restaurant. It has been sold, it has different owners, it's still Fong Chong, but it's 1 story only. Had a fire about 20 years ago, and so lost its upper stories. But there's nothing left otherwise of these buildings along Northwest 4th, with the exception of the one you can't even see. Back up 2 slides. There you go. No, next one. To the far left, the edge of the building. There you go. That is actually a former warehouse. It's an 1882 building, the Overton Warehouse, which the Lee family turned into family businesses and apartments. It is still standing. It has new owners, and they are now renovating it and turning it into a creative office space. And the members of the families who grew up there are thrilled, and so am I. It will be preserved. So let's continue with these, and I'll just talk our way through them. Keep going. These are photographs of individuals, families that are still important who lived in one of those 2 buildings. Keep going. This is the CCBA at 315 Northwest Davis between 3rd and 4th. And this is a group of young men and women who are being trained in the arts of lion dance in the 30s. This is also the site of the Chinese language school, which all Chinese kids, Chinese American kids, growing up in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, still going, had to go to every day after public school and all morning on Saturday. Many say they didn't learn much Chinese, but this is where they established that very tight bond with others who they had grown up with, other families, and that those bonds are still very strong. And then we have, again, another boys' club in marching during a Chinese New Year parade in the 30s. And
then we go to African American.
That's it. Okay. So now we're going to the African Americans. Have I lost myself? What? Sorry. I was there. African Americans had worked and lived in the North End from the 1850s. And in the 1890s, the completion of the Albina Rail Center on the east side of the river created jobs for African Americans and spawned a new community, which we know today, north and east of the Broadway Bridge. Simultaneously, however, a small group of African American migrants were being recruited from the southern states by the Northern Pacific Railroad and the posh new Portland Hotel. These upwardly mobile professional dining car and hotel workers, haberdashers, barbers, restaurant, pool hall, and hotel operators moved into the North End, creating a middle-class community which sustained itself until the 1950s. Members of the Portland's rising African American middle class usually began, please change it, yeah, began as railway porters, barbers, or as waiters. William H. Rutherford was recruited as a barber for the Portland Hotel in 1897 and later worked for the Northern Pacific. You will see his brother Edward Rutherford at the very far right in this photograph. By 1920, the Rutherfords had invested their earnings in the Rutherford Brothers Haberdashery at Northwest 6th and Flanders, which also included a barber shop, cigar, and confectionery store. The axis of North End African American business life in the 1920s and 30s ran from east to west along Northwest Flanders and Everett from 3rd to 9th Avenue. The barber shop, usually in combination with a cafe, bar, or pool hall, functioned as a social hub. The Rutherfords operated barber shops at one time or another on Northwest 3rd and Everett and on Flanders west of 4th, next door to Frankie Baker's shoe shine stop. This is of Frankie and Johnny fame. W.T. Becton ran one of the neighborhood's more popular combination establishments at 835 Northwest Flanders. So this African American historic district or corridor could run from 3rd and Flanders across from the Classical Garden into the park blocks. With, as we'll see here, the center was the Golden West Hotel, the center of African American social life, owned and managed by W.D. Allen, which had a cabaret in the basement, supposedly the largest gambling establishment between St. Louis and the West Coast. It had a restaurant. It had a barbershop established by Dick Bogle's father, Waldo Bogle, who'd come from Walla Walla. It had athletic facilities and other kinds of shops. It was the social center on Sundays. You saw this photograph of the picnic with children earlier. There were 2 African American churches nearby, and on Sunday after church, this new middle class elite would converge at the restaurant at the Golden West for fried chicken, remembered fondly by Catherine Bogle. And for those of you who have not been in this neighborhood for a while, you can visit the Golden West. There is a 5-window display on 2 sides of the building and an audio installation where you can hear Catherine Bogle and others talk about their experiences in the 20s and 30s at the Golden West Hotel. Most North End African Americans did not rent rooms in the small local hotels run by Japanese proprietors, and there were very few places they could actually live. And you will see here many entertainers, back up, many entertainers stayed at the Golden West, black entertainers, but so did athletic teams such as this one. There were very few places in Portland where prominent blacks were allowed to stay in these years. So the Golden West Hotel served a very, very important function. And African Americans themselves, as a result, really didn't attempt to find rooms in some of these local hotels, although they did find the Chinese to be hospitable, and there's a tradition dating back to this period of fondness for Chinese food on the part of the African American community. They chose instead to live behind their storefront businesses, or like the Nikkei and the Chinese, to rent houses or even own houses where they could through white purchasers on the east side. We're seeing here the Royal Palm Hotel, which could have easily been in the Japanese or Japantown section, but this is a really interesting hotel on the eastern end of the African American Historic Corridor, which housed many prominent Pullman porters and others who worked for a long time for the railroad, but many other ethnic groups as well. And this was managed by the Kitayama family. The son of this family, Canon Kitayama, who's now, I think, in his late 80s, is someone that I've had the privilege of knowing for 10 or 15 years and has talked really with great enthusiasm about the sort of high-toned nature, as they called it, of this hotel. We're going to turn now to Southern Europeans, which, as I noted earlier, had their own problems in Portland, even though they were European. 6th Avenue emerged early on as the preferred business location for Italian, Jewish, and Greek immigrants arriving through Union Station. After 1910, numerous small groceries, clothing and shoe stores, barber shops, jewelry stores, and pawn shops line both sides of bustling 6th Avenue from Cooch to the foot of the railroad station. Did you point out 6th? Okay, let's try to do that. Let's do that. So 6th is very close to the park blocks. It's right there, that's it. So the train station is at the end. And so this became actually, you've seen that wonderful photograph at the front end of this section where you can see the train station from Burnside. This became a small, bustling business district, and many of the new arrivals into the Union Station were the first salesmen, the first white-collar workers, and many of these hotels created in the neighborhood were meant for them. So this was a neighborhood that many immigrants saw as able to provide prosperity and success for them. So after 1910, numerous small groceries, clothing, shoe stores, barber shops, jewelry stores, pawn shops line both sides of bustling 6th Avenue from Cooch to the foot of the railroad station. Jewelers named Rossi, like this one, Rogaway, and Feinberg, and barbers named Orloff and Bolas shared block space with a locksmith, plumber, and blacksmith, and residential hotels like the Butte Hotel, which is still there, at Northwest 6th and Davis. Greek and Sephardic, German, and Polish Jews monopolized commerce along Northwest 6th, Northwest 5th, and Northwest 3rd Avenue after 1920. Here we have the Vlahakis grocery store. Louis Vlahakis came to Portland about 1917 from the Columbia River canneries, and in partnership with Peter Regas, he established a grocery at the corner of Northwest 6th and Cooch, which continued until under his wife and daughter's management until the 1970s. Many of you probably won't recognize her look on the right, but this is Mary Miletus, and her family also established a Greek grocery store at the corner of Northwest 3rd and Cooch, and reputedly offered the first feta cheese in Portland. They also served a very diverse clientele, including Scandinavian loggers and fishermen, and they became bankers often for many of these working men who would bring in their pay and go out on a night in the town and would rely upon the Miletus family to take care of their money so that they didn't spend it all. Other Greek businesses along 6th Avenue, George Giamakis the tailor and Gus Bolas's People's Barber Shop, catered to Greek and other working men. The majority of the North End's Greek residents were single male railroad or cannery workers who lived and died in small one-room hotels, arguing politics and gambling in nearby all-male Greek coffee houses, and spending their meager paychecks home to pay for their sisters' dowries. One unheralded Greek railroad worker, George Stephopoulos, etched his mythological reveries on the supporting columns of the former Lovejoy ramp. How many of you remember these? 2 of them. I mean, we really had hoped. Old Town really wanted several of these since that was his home in the rich hotel at Cooch and 2nd. And they've been sitting in a yard in the Pearl under the ramp of the Lovejoy Bridge for so many years that most of the images are gone. But we do have 2 that have been preserved and are in the Pearl, thanks to John Carroll. Building upon an existing Jewish tradition of dry goods and garment manufacture and wholesaling in the North End, dating back to the 1860s, Sephardic and Polish Jewish immigrants joined with their Bavarian predecessors, Fleischner, Meyer and Company, L. Goldsmith, and the Hirsch Weiss Company, to build a central wholesale dry goods and clothing district. And I'll say something about this in a minute. This really was the first wholesale dry goods, produce, electrical materials in Portland, and it would continue into the 50s. And then many of these merchants complained that it was superhighways, suburbs, big box stores, which drove them out of business. But these were largely Jewish merchants and very successful merchants indeed. When they first arrived from the island of Rhodes in 1911, Nisim Menashe and his brothers from the island of Rhodes, these are Sephardic Jews, opened shoe repair and second-hand shoe stores on West Burnside and Northwest 6th. Soon, however, Nisim and his sons had expanded to groceries, wholesale clothing, particularly working men's wear, electronics, and in the 1950s, uniforms. And we see here Albert Menashe and his first and second grocery stores on Northwest 6th, and then finally a brother Sam and his store also on another one. There we go. Both Sams, Sam the Blonde and Sam A. in front of their store, also on Northwest 6th. It's been sort of fascinating to go through these early city directories. I mean, there were seven brothers, and they all had kids, and they're all on Northwest 6th in the 20s and 30s. Even bigger players opened wholesale establishments on 5th Avenue from Burnside to Cooch. We have here the Nathan Weinstein Company, the Gewurz Furniture Company, and the Nathan and Samuel Weinstein Company. Wholesale clothing occupied adjacent warehouse and office space for a time in the 20s and 30s, to be joined in 1937 by the Goldsmith Company, founded by Archie Goldsmith. Some of you may remember the Goldsmith Company. They dominated Portland's wholesale dry goods and notions businesses until the 1950s, when, as I suggested, freeways and malls rendered the downtown wholesale garment district obsolete. Archie Goldsmith's son Alan liked to say it was women's lib that was the firm's undoing, as women gave up the sewing machine for ready wear. Russian and Polish Jews also set up shop on 3rd Avenue, operating secondhand stores, clothing stores, and shoe repair stores, change, like Harry Weinstein's Working Men's Shoes Repair on Northwest Cooch between 2nd and 3rd. Harry Steinberg was called the mayor of Cooch. There were lots of mayors at Old Town. I guess this was something that the different ethnic groups, liked to sort of name somebody who really held sway on a particular block. But Harry Steinberg is really quite a character. And one of the things that this Old Town History Project that Amy was talking about earlier is sort of been planning, we hope we get the grant to do it, is to do a series of soundscapes on the exterior of some of these buildings so that you walk by and suddenly for 12 feet you're in an envelope and it's a time capsule and you're not sure where you are, but you're you're there, and you're hearing sounds that pertain to the people who worked and lived there. And we have, and miraculously, a niece of Harry Steinberg recorded him singing in his shop love and revolutionary Russian songs in Yiddish. And so that will be part of the soundscape, I guarantee you. Such stores, along with Gus Apostle's Old Town Cafe at Northwest 3rd and Cooch, across the street from the Miletus Grocery, cater to a different clientele than the wholesale establishments along 5th and 6th. In fact, from the war years onward, as the North End slid slowly into Skid Row, 3rd Avenue became a kind of service center for Scandinavian, Greek, and other loggers, Southern immigrants, African Americans, Native Americans, loggers, day laborers, and transients, both in and out of work. The arrival of the first Roma, or gypsies, in the North End cannot be dated with precision, although their presence was noted as early as the 1920s. By the late 40s and early 50s, after the Japanese had been forced to abandon their homes and businesses in Nihomachi, and the Chinese began to buy homes in southeast Portland, the Roma began to occupy the empty storefronts. What happened to the new Wow May? Did we just do that already? Back up. Yeah, there we go. In this building, the Roma were occupying the storefronts to the right, the two closest to the corner. 2 gypsy princesses, Roma princesses, lived there. Their father, this is a Ristic family, was closely related to a king of the gypsies, and one of the events in Old Town during this period was a major funeral of the son of the king. And also, this was a building which housed the Manila Eats restaurant at 3rd and Davis, and the New Bataan Cafe nearby, housing a largely hidden Filipino population during the 1930s when the Filipino Canneries Union met there. Former African Americans and Greek workers remember the water poured out on the streets, the weeping violins, the women following the funeral cortege of the son of the king of the gypsies in the 1950s. They remember the Roma princesses and the fortune tellers teasing passerbys into storefronts on Northwest 3rd and Davis. They remember the celebrations of the Ristic family on St. George's Day and the gypsy girls in the Skidmore Fountain. They are all gone now. What has happened to this richly diverse Portland? Its ethnic groups, their homes, businesses, places of significance. Slow down. That's it. Well, I didn't drive too many of you away. That's good. I think we have time for questions.
Yep.
No? Yeah? Questions? Comments? Wow.
Oh, there's someone way in the back.
Yes, could you? Yeah.
Yet we still feel like in Portland that we have this super
Well, I don't know if everybody heard her. She's contrasting what is a pretty dark history around race and identity and privilege in Portland with what appears to be this very progressive political stance and set of ideals. And how is that, right? I mean, how do they fit together? I think that's a really great question, and I think it's a complicated question. I mean, one of the prejudices that I've had as an historian, and I'm finally letting go of it because I have become now really very seriously involved in trying to protect this place. I mean, I've been persuaded that the place is vitally important, even though the architecture may not be completely stunning like the Skidmore district. But what I've always found is that Portland is one of those places where you find people who are, rabidly environmentally conscious, and perhaps too, very proud of their architecture and the livability of the city. And it is, and I mean, as a somewhat transplant, I've been here 25 years now. I mean, it is an incredibly livable city with beautiful homes, and architecture, although we have lost the most beautiful part of that. But what I have sort of been struck by over the years, even as a graduate student, is that there seems to be a divide between, the orientation anyway, between people who are socially active politically, I mean, who are what I would call myself a social historian, a social ethnic historian, and that there seems to be on the part of people who are driven more by the imperatives of protecting the environment, protecting, the architectural heritage of the city, less attention on people and people's stories. And it's true that this is a city that remarkably, and Seattle too, these are cities that, for whatever reason, the really deep social ethnic history has really not been probed or written about. I mean, what I'm presenting here is pretty much of a gloss. It's a really fast sort of overview. I'm not trying to dig very deep here for you, but it's a really completely, I think, virgin and very important subject that we as Portlanders really need to comprehend. I mean, I would like all of us to know about and to embrace this amazing diversity that Portland has been. We think of ourselves as a very white state, and we are. We are still. I think that's beginning to change. But it's not as though there were not always people of color here who, in the face of this incredible set of laws and prejudice and exclusion and discrimination, nonetheless made very successful lives for themselves and their communities. I mean, this is really a story of all these groups. If it seemed a little upbeat, I meant it to be. I mean, these are people that really managed to really do something really significant in the creation of community and enduring community at that. So I don't know. I would like, I'd like to hear what some of the rest of you think. I mean, do you see this as a disjunction? Is this a new story? Yeah.
1885, massacre in Rock Creek, Wyoming, Tacoma's Chinatown burned and Chinese expelled. The Chinese actually came on train, is that correct, back to Portland?
Down from Tacoma, yes, they fled to Portland, yes. They thought Portland was safer.
And a Jewish mayor
Yes,
protected them.
yes, that's right, that's right.
And then I see Chinese workers driven out of Albina and Mount Cape,
Yes.
which I had no idea.
Yes, and that was going to be, well, these were a group of labor activists who'd come up from California, who really were trying to kind of roil the political waters here. And again, it was this group of Chinese merchants and other elite merchants who had a stake, I think, in Chinese labor, quite honestly. This is another thing that we haven't even dug deeply yet into this, but I'm sure that there are all kinds of partnerships between major elite businessmen and Chinese merchants, and mainly as labor contractors. So there's a real reason why they're protected, but the trouble is that by the time you get to when the real problem occurs, which is when all of these workers start to return, when the Japanese are brought in as replacements, and these are all basically workers who have been recruited from rural areas of China. They are not skilled, they are not commercial animals, and they really don't have the wherewithal to support themselves, and so they flood Portland. And at that point in time, Portland is not particularly a friendly place, and so it isn't surprising, I guess. I mean, this is a statistic that is sort of stunning, that while San Francisco and Seattle began to empty out very quickly after 1882, that we don't begin to see a real decline in the Chinese population here until after 1910. But what happens then, though, is that those Chinese who fled to Portland and started to leave, they're now repopulating San Francisco and Seattle, and the population here just continues to plummet and plummet and plummet. The other cities, the Chinese populations rebound, and they don't here until the 60s. So there's something going on in Portland, after 1910 that really has changed, and it really is an ugly environment for people of color. Yeah.
One of the problems of history is judging the values of the past with the values of today.
Sure.
I was thinking of things that were fairly common up until the 30s or 40s, such as eugenics, social Darwinism, and the doctrine of discovery. Could you talk more about how those values?
Well, all those things are true, but this is why I sort of try to include at the front end of my talk. I mean, to try to put this in the perspective of a larger, group of even neighboring states. That it's true. I mean, someone said to me a couple of weeks ago when I said, I want to make something of the fact that the territorial constitution, has basically a racial exclusion clause, and this person said, who is an historian, also said, well, yes, but that was ubiquitous at the time. And that's true. But it is telling, it seems to me, that if California and Washington State are passing public accommodation laws before 1920, and we can't do so until 1953, that people that I'm still interviewing who as children, were turned away from swimming at Jansen Beach or from going in and using the ladies' restroom at Meyer and Frank. And I'm not even talking about people who are African American, Chinese, or Japanese. I mean, these are people who are Greek. So I think there is something here that is, I won't say it's a miss, but I think we've missed it. I think we've missed it. And I think we need to pay attention and figure it out for ourselves.
Someone way in the back.
Where are you?
Somebody way back there? Raise their hand? Yes? No? Maybe not.
No, okay.
I'm saying things.
There's someone right here.
Yeah.
Hey, so I'm a recent transplant from San Francisco, and I was really interested in hearing that Portland had the second largest Chinatown in the United States. And I was wondering, I feel like in San Francisco, Chinatown feels like a huge part of the city's identity, and the Chinese culture feels like a huge part of what people think about when they think about San Francisco. But I didn't even know that Portland had an especially large Chinatown, and it doesn't feel like something that's really talked about, at least by people who don't live here when they're thinking about Portland. I'm wondering why there's this huge distinction. Yeah, I've driven past it, but I don't know, it doesn't feel like it permeates the rest of the city.
Well, I think that's a good observation. I do. I mean, but it's also true that, as I did point out, that the original Chinatown, old Chinatown, which was an amazing place, not just by all accounts, we can see it visually, we can really begin to describe it in detail, was large. By the time you get to the 1950s, this is a tiny Chinese population. Ironically, of course, now the Asian population is growing, and we have two incipient new Chinatowns. Now they don't look like Chinatowns. That's the problem. I mean, they're strip malls. I mean, one is along 82nd Street and the other is in Beaverton. But as someone pointed out to me, a Chinese merchant who chose to relocate, he came from Hong Kong, who chose to open his, he's a CPA, his business in the heart of Chinatown, right across the street from the CCBA about 25 years ago. As he said to me recently, he said, yes, that's true, but this is the historic Chinatown. And that is true. And the people who had businesses there, who grew up there, who went to school at the CCBA, who played in the streets, who were in, some of them were actually in Chinese opera, which was performed at the CCBA, belonged to the women's club, went to activities in their family associations and tongs. Food is really important. Ate at those restaurants until, it's only about 10 years, 15, not even that, 10 years. When I started working down there intensively in the mid to late 90s, and until about 2006 or so, 5 or 6, there was a pretty large Chinese New Year's traditional parade with firecrackers and going by store, with the lion dance and the lettuce and all that sort of stuff. It's gone, it's vanished. And partly the reason it vanished is because we tried to change it and improve it. And so the city, the Portland Development Commission has in the last decade basically spent millions of dollars in 2 streetscape programs, each of which was a year's duration, which tore up the streets, made it impossible to park, so that all of the old people, who don't live there, but always came down to the restaurants, they came down to gamble, they came down to socialize in the evening, couldn't get into the neighborhood, couldn't park. And then the worst thing of all, this is a slum, right? It's not a slum, but people think it is. But so at the end of this first streetscape, what did they do? They took out all of the indigenous trees and they put in new trees, including palm trees. And they got rid of the historic streets and curbs. And then they put in parking meters. And Chinese elders just thought, I'm sorry, but I'm going to 82nd Street. That was just, an insult. And, of course, because of the inability to really get access to those restaurants for such a long time, if it didn't get you in the first one, the second one, finally did, that all but one of the original owners of these restaurants who were from the indigenous community were forced to sell to new immigrants. And so we've got now, in the main, restaurant owners who in Chinatown who are from Hong Kong or elsewhere who don't have a vested interest in the neighborhood, and they don't serve dim sum anymore. So now we're all in this place, right? I'm working with a lot of Chinese elders these days, and we're all sort of saying, what can happen here? Can anybody ever come back? Can we change these restaurants? Can we make it what it was? We have a gate. We've got the CCBA. We've got tongs. We've got remaining property owners who are Chinese from the old families. Nothing is impossible. But it's a crisis. It is. And so I'm delighted to have had this opportunity to talk with you about it. I think it's important for Portland to try to recognize, to be conscious of what it has left, to see whether we can make more of what is left. Yes?
The work that you're doing sounds fascinating. Do you care to give us a plug? Is there an organization you're affiliated with or perhaps a website?
Well, we're kind of low tech, I have to tell you. I'm actually working with 2 organizations right now. The Old Town History Project was something that I formed with several other people back in 2000, which never became a full-fledged nonprofit, and now it's just kind of a bunch of us who are doing work for free. But it was intended as an umbrella for all of the ethnic groups in the neighborhood, some of whom were well on the path to creating their own museums, like the Oregon Jewish Museum, which has left Old Town and has a fabulous new museum now on Northwest Kearney. And the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center is a full-fledged, again, very professional museum and archive in the neighborhood, still in Japantown. The Greek community now has a small museum in the Greek Orthodox Church. The Chinese Museum, however, was created, and it really isn't a museum, there was a fourth floor in the CCBA 30 years ago where a display was created, but there's no elevator, there's no ADA access, and it's very old. And so a year and a half ago, I agreed to cease to work kind of in collaboration with all of these groups, as I had been doing for quite a long time, and to devote my time as much as I could to helping the Chinese develop their own small museum or some kind of project that's going to, all these things are tied together. It's about saving the neighborhood. It's about saving the historic district, as much as it's about, saving their history. That's all bound up together. And so I have agreed to do that. And so there is a new nonprofit. It's called it does have a website. There's not much on it yet, but there will be, I think, in coming months. It's called the Portland Chinatown History and Museum Foundation, and it has a board of 12 people, and I am the only non-Chinese member of that board. They all represent these old families and old businesses, and I'm very proud to say that this is a vital and progressive group that I think will have an impact. If you don't know about Chinatown and Portland's Chinese history now, you will.